There are a lot of reliable people that I go to who are my age, like Dr. Oren and Yossi Klein Halevi. Then there's you. You're a new generation of public intellectual in Israel. Do you find this disconcerting to have gone from an Israeli reporter, journalist, analyst to being someone that everyone in America wants to hear from who at least doesn't hate Israel?
Yeah, I spend most of my time actually teaching, including college-age kids, and lecturing, and doing journalism. And so this is new for me. Very happy to be useful. But also, I'm not sure you have more white hair than me, so I don't know with these young people today.
Well, Haviv, talk to me a little bit about what you expect out of the War Cabinet tonight.
There is a very fateful decision that the cabinet has to make. It has to do with whether or not they go into Rafah. It has to do with the kinds of pressure that they're facing from the Arab world, including the moderate Arab world, the Arab world that's frankly, not to beat around the bush, on Israel's side of this war and wishes Hamas would be destroyed. But nevertheless, the politics of the Arab world, the politics in the West, the war has dragged on for 7 months, and there is this pressure for this agreement. 3 weeks ago, it was becoming absolutely obvious to everybody that Israel was going into Rafah. There were tents set up for civilian refugees to flee to out of the war zone. Israeli divisions have been called up. Call-up orders went out to certain reserve units. And that's exactly when Hamas, a week and a half ago, began to be very flexible on the question of a hostage exchange and a ceasefire, some kind of limited ceasefire. Over the last 10 days, it looks like Hamas has kind of decided that Rafah is something that Israel faces too much pressure and might actually delay or not do properly. And so the hostage exchange and ceasefire are off the table. The only way to get a ceasefire out of Hamas, the only way to get hostages out of Hamas is to be willing and able, and also to actually do the massive military pressure that is the only language Hamas understands. So I think that what the cabinet is going to debate is how we up that military pressure to get them back to the table, and if not back to the table, then out of Gaza.
Haviv, have you seen streams of Gazans leaving Rafah to go to the new camps that have been established by the IDF?
There are reports of about 200,000 Gazan civilians that have already left Rafah. That's about a fifth of the number that have to be cleared out so they don't get hurt. There's a good chance that Rafah is going to be the most difficult battle of the entire war, because about 40% of Hamas's fighting forces are hiding in Rafah, and they have nowhere to go this time. They can't run to the south as they've done until now. Rafah is as far south as you get before you hit Egypt. And so it's going to be a bitter battle. We need to move at least 1 million people. 200,000, it looks like, have already left. Not to the Israeli tent areas set up for them, but to other parts of southern Gaza, to other, maybe even central Gaza. The Israelis have technology and checkpoints in place to make sure Hamas fighters aren't among them. I don't know if it's perfect. I don't know how well it's going to work, but there is that effort. And there is going to be this significant, dramatic attempt to separate between the civilian population and Hamas. Of course, that's Hamas's fundamental strategy, is to make sure that the only way to get to them is to go through civilians. And Israel's supreme interest, Blinken is literally in the region right now, is to have as low a Palestinian civilian death toll as possible. So 200,000 have gone. Hopefully they can do better.
Haviv, I know there are protests all over the United States, but do Israelis know that the vote in Congress is actually the real test of American support for Israel? It was an overwhelming vote of billions and billions of dollars, and I don't believe the world has turned on Israel. I believe the same suspects like Joseph Borrell of the EU, who were never with Israel, are just louder now. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll tell you, what shocks me is how badly the Palestinian activist world can screw up a moment like this. Because think about their situation. They are actually suffering terribly, the Palestinians in Gaza. They do actually need the world's sympathy and help. And how could you not translate that into specific hard actions on the ground, that the kind that the Biden administration has frankly been demanding from Israel, the kind that I, in conversations with you over the last 2 months, have been wishing and talking openly about Israel needing to do, that help the Palestinians, but don't tell the Israelis, I'm sorry, you have to leave Hamas in power in Gaza, which is just going to make sure there's more war. The fact is that Hamas has created a unity among people around the world, governments, parliaments, in support of this war effort, because Hamas promises more war. And so, look, if you're a member of Congress, the Democrats and the Republicans are divided on Israel. And the fact is that a lot of Democrats want a Palestinian state. If there was a Palestinian faction, if Israel faced a Palestinian faction that said, let's reconcile, give us our place in the sun, have some significant withdrawal, there will be peace at the end of this and not another bloodbath like we saw in 2000 after the Oslo process, or after we pulled out of Gaza, it ended in October 7th. No, we're going to actually create a peace. If the Palestinians could bring forward those kinds of politics, they would divide Congress. And good on them. But their side is Hamas right now. And that is uniting everybody. It's uniting Israelis. Deep left Israelis who yearn for Palestinian self-determination are fighting in uniform in Gaza to destroy Hamas. And so, yeah, I first of all, thank you, America. Second of all, I wish the Palestinians could do better, because it'd be great to get to some kind of end to this conflict and real reconciliation.
Haviv, I know, because you have been a guest on the Commentary podcast before, that you're familiar with John Podhoretz and Abe Greenwald and Seth Mandel and Matt Continetti and Christine Rosen. Yesterday, Seth Mandel said something that really stuck with me. His kids cosplay Harry Potter. They get their wands out and they pretend that they're Harry Potter and Hermione and all that. What do you make of these kids on campuses in America? It does seem to me like they're cosplaying Gazans, and in doing so, they are in fact disrespecting the pain that Gaza is going through.
I for the last 6 months, I've thought that they're not on my radar. They're not important to me. They are living through their own little adventure, and I wish them luck. And I'm glad young people care about the world. I don't know. I didn't have a serious response. I think over the last month, I have really begun to see, people have been sending me, and we've been actually talking about the sheer volume of videos, of speeches, of social media posts. And we saw this on October 8th. This isn't new, but I wasn't paying so much attention, that are absolutely and passionately in support of Hamas and lionize and celebrate October 7th. And I have come to the conclusion that these kids, in their crusade, in their attempt to find this religious fervor and go off and redeem the world by finding the enemy and destroying the enemy, are actually causing terrible harm to the Palestinians. Because the only thing Israelis, I'll put it very simply, the Israeli psyche is where Palestinian self-determination will be won. Within Israeli politics, within Israeli debate, the Israelis have to be convinced, left-wing Israelis, right-wing Israelis, in as much as you can, have to be convinced that Palestinian self-determination does not mean what Hamas claims it means, which is the extermination of Israelis. And if they're not convinced of that, you're not going to move them. You can sanction us and cut our economy in half. You can bomb us like NATO bombed Belgrade once to, over Kosovo. It's still not going to work if I think that handing Hamas territory is going to murder my children. So these kids have been broadcasting the stuff that gets out of these. I'm sure a lot of these kids are decent people, slightly ignorant foreigners. Why should they know a lot about a conflict far away? Who just kind of, they want the social networking of this protest. They want all kinds of things that are, they're decent, they're fine, let them. But the activist heart of this movement and these protests have been screaming and shouting about Hamas and about October 7th and about the justice of the massacre of Israeli civilians. And that's the part of it that Israelis see. And so in the Israeli mind, not only is Hamas the preeminent political faction among the Palestinians, the heart of the Palestinian national movement, the reason that even an Israeli left-winger can't withdraw from territory, but even their Western left-wing supporters ultimately are pro-war and pro the death of Israeli civilians.
Let's go back to these demonstrators. I don't expect kids to know a lot either, but I expect them to know what the Ottoman Empire is, what the British Mandate was, and what happened in Jerusalem in AD 70 with the Romans. They don't know that. Do you think they actually understand Hamas? Do they really understand what Hamas wants?
I think there's a diversity of groups there. There are a lot of kids who they saw on TikTok dead children. I want that to make them horrified and sad and angry and mobilize them. That's the good thing that we saw in the it's a war, and it's a war in which one side is deeply embedded as its fundamental strategy underneath civilians. That's not new. It's not a new strategy. The Viet Cong did it. The FLN of Algeria did it against the French. But nevertheless, it is the Hamas strategy, and it's producing images that these kids are responding to. There's a lot of that. I don't want to take it away. But the activist heart, the people organizing, and the screams, the shouts, the chants, the explanations they give when the press actually asks them hard, specific policy and ideology questions are pro-Hamas. They're pro-Hamas. Hamas has the right, they say openly, to massacre Israeli civilians. And the problem for Israelis is Israelis believe, I don't know the objective historical truth, only God does, but Israelis believe that they have lived through now 30 years of attempting to make peace processes that not that they didn't succeed, but that every Israeli withdrawal, the Oslo withdrawal of the 90s that established the Palestinian Authority, pulled the Israeli army out of every Palestinian city, and they were having negotiations in 2000 for a full Palestinian state. That's Bill Clinton's version of the story, not the Israeli version of the story. Every attempt like that ends in rivers of blood. It ended in 140 suicide bombings that to this day Israelis can't explain. Palestinians can't explain to Israelis why 140 suicide bombings happened between 2000 and 2003. So Israelis live in a history that's their own, that they know instinctively, that American activists wouldn't know, because why would you know something? Just because you have an opinion about something doesn't mean you have to actually read about it or learn about it. So I really, truly believe that there is a huge number of just ignorant, decent, well-meaning students, led by a coterie of radical ideologues utterly willing and even eager to see mass death among Israeli Jews, frankly, just who want to murder my children.
I think you're right. Haviv, the banner went out in Hamilton Hall earlier this week, Intifada. And I thought, oh my God, they have no idea. I broadcast through it. I was on the air. This show began on July 10th of 2000. So we broadcast the news every day because of great interest in America. But when you see that word, what does it mean to you? What do you think the average student should know about Intifada?
You know, in that one word, you can encapsulate the entire arc of the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy of the last 40 years. Intifada in Arabic means a throwing off, and it's a word that Palestinians use to describe attempting to remove Israeli military rule in the West Bank and Gaza. There were two intifadas. The first intifada was from 1987 to 1992. It was many things, terror attacks, but not just terror attacks, also kids throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers who patrolled their cities. It was experienced by huge parts of Israeli society as a moral argument by Palestinians to tell Israelis, hey, we need to figure this out. We need to end this. You owe us answers. This can't just continue forever and ever. And that sparked the peace process. That sparked the 1992 beginning of the Oslo peace process that saw Israeli soldiers pull out of all the Palestinian cities. And beginning in 2000, from about 98 to 2000, the Israeli army pulls out of all the Palestinian cities, and they're having final status negotiations in Washington. And then in the fall of 2000 begins the second intifada. And that's the intifada that in the Israeli mind is burned into their psyche to this day. We live in the shadow of it to this day. And if you want to understand Israelis, you need to understand that intifada. Because at the height of the peace process, without any Israeli soldier in any Palestinian city, and Barak and Arafat, the Israeli and Palestinian leaders at Camp David with Bill Clinton negotiating shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount and permanent Palestinian statehood, that's when a wave of 140 suicide bombings begins over the next 3 years that shatters the Israeli left for a generation. These are buses blowing up in the mornings in every big city. In the city of Jerusalem, for example, most places don't have school buses. A 7:30 a.m. bus blowing up in the city of Jerusalem is a school bus, basically. I was a young soldier in 2000, and my little brother was in the shuk, the market in the center of Jerusalem, and saw a suicide bombing. He was standing in the road. He looked down the road, and a bombing blew up in front of him that killed the daughter of the Minister of Science in the government at the time. The second intifada was a time when parents put their kids on their way to school on two different buses so that if one blows up, doesn't take both kids.
Wow.
It was a time when people were, it was a time that you can't, and it was 140. I want you, imagine, okay, on some deeply divisive American political question that really is a fracture in the culture war, immigration or race or something like that, imagine a wave of 140 suicide bombings. What would that do to American politics? That's what it did to Israeli politics. And Israel's a much smaller country to absorb 140 bombings than America is. So we are talking about a shattering effect, and it devastated the peace process, and it devastated within Israeli Jewish debate people who said the Palestinians can deliver a peace. They can, their politics can reciprocate our withdrawals with peace, because nobody knew what the second intifada was about. The first intifada starts in 87 when Israeli soldiers are patrolling Palestinian cities. There's kids walking home from school are passing Israeli soldiers running traffic. There's no Palestinian police. There's barely a Palestinian municipality. But in 2000, none of that was true anymore. What was the second intifada about? To this day, Palestinians don't explain it to Israelis, and Israelis are convinced that their politics are just too dysfunctional and too radical to ever reciprocate a withdrawal. And so the Israeli left has essentially been out of power since that intifada. So when you carry a banner that says intifada, and you think you're saying, we're Che Guevara, the revolutionaries, never mind how racist and violent Che Guevara was, don't ever tell them, they'll be very sad. But when you think that you're just carrying some kind of revolutionary banner, to Israelis you're saying, we're coming to murder your children. Get ready for the bus bombings.
Haviv, we're going to go to...
That's a disaster, by the way, not for Israelis, but for Palestinians. That's the key point.
Right. That is the fundamental misapprehension of facts leads to tragedy. Haviv, I want to talk about the hostage families. This week, the absolutely necessary Dan Senor, who has really filled a gap in America, and his Call Me Back podcast and you being on it has really opened up a lot of eyes. He hosted Rachel and John Pullen, the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Pullen, Rachel Goldberg, John Pullen. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely the most heartbreaking, because I'm a parent of three like you. You're a father. You know what it's like. I can't imagine the pain. At the same time, Dr. Orange just told me there's a majority and minority view within the hostage families. How do you describe what the hostage families think about Rafah right now?
At the end of October, Defense Minister Gallant made an argument to Israelis that Israelis have basically clung to until now. It's starting to change, but the argument was Hamas aren't going to give us those hostages out of the kindness of their hearts. They took them, they intend to keep them, they are cruel, they are brutal, they're the mass murderers of Palestinians, it's never mind Israelis. There's no way to get the hostages out, except by giving us hostages being the only way Hamas survives. Massive military pressure going to this war is what's going to get the hostages back. Hamas was saying at the time, back in October, if you start the war, you won't get any hostages. Gallant said, watch me. And he was right. By November, Hamas was willing to give us massive numbers of hostages, including very nearly all the children. There's still 2 children left in Gaza. An 18-year-old woman also, technically not a child, but there are people still left in Gaza, obviously, many, but we got more out than anybody expected, and we got it out by massive military pressure. So the families have basically trusted the government on this question of massive military pressure. I think that the problem now is that it's 7 months in, and there is a powerful sense among Israelis that the leadership of this government, I hate to get political, but as former President Trump said, it's concern over Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a deeply distrusted figure in Israeli politics, among the Israeli public, including among the right. In every poll, right-wing voters say they don't trust what he says. They still think he's better than the left or the center, but they don't trust when he says things. Netanyahu started talking recently in the last couple of months about absolute complete victory. That moment he started talking about a complete and total victory was the moment a lot of Israelis started doubting whether there was going to be a complete and total victory. And we've basically been stalled in a lot of this because Netanyahu was bending either to American pressure or to Israeli domestic pressure. And that sense that you can't quite trust Netanyahu to pursue even the strategy that Gallant laid out back in October, and Gallant himself led it massively successfully, got out half the hostages. But we no longer have that trust as a public of Netanyahu. There was a poll just last week. Do you believe in Netanyahu? When Netanyahu says complete victory, 67% said no, 18% said yes. So the distrust is deep, and it's real, and it's deep, and it's most of the Israeli right, not some. And that has created among the hostage families a desperate desire just to get them out. If there's not going to be massive military pressure that'll get them out, if even Gallant's strategy isn't going to work, then just give anything. Give away the bank. Let them survive this war. Let Hamas, they don't care about winning or losing the war. They want their kids back. There is a minority among the hostages. And by the way, I have such profound sympathy for that. They're the tragic story here. There is a minority among the families that says, basically Gallant's strategy. We're still not going to get them out unless there's massive military pressure, and it's Hamas's only way to survive. So please get back to the war. And they're just as angry at Netanyahu, by the way, for the war stalling as they perceive it. But that's the debate among the hostage families.
Gaza belonged to Egypt prior to the 1967 war that was triggered by Nasser. Then Israel took it over. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, then prime minister, said, we're out of here. And it was very controversial. I covered it and not sure it was right. Looking back, before we look forward, do you think Sharon did the right thing in 2005, knowing what we know now about Hamas?
It's a very good question. I supported it at the time. And I think my rationale for supporting it at the time was sound. And it basically came out, the basic idea, just so people, whether or not I think retroactively it was smart is less important than what Ariel Sharon thought and what the consequences have been for Israeli politics since. So let me try and explain what Israelis see. The idea was that in 2000, the Second Intifada begins. By 2003, in April of 2002, after what we call the Passover Massacre, which is one of the worst of the suicide bombings of the Second Intifada, where a bomber walks into a hotel ballroom with 200 people celebrating the Passover Seder and blows himself up. I think he kills something like 30 people.
I remember it well.
And Sharon declares... Right. And Sharon declares Operation Defensive Shield, which is essentially an infantry invasion of Palestinian cities. It's rolling back Oslo. We left Palestinian cities. We took down not just the army, but also all the intelligence infrastructure, and we couldn't see the bombers coming. And so we rebuilt all of it. This was my war. I was in the Israeli infantry in a battalion in the northern West Bank during Defensive Shield. And it worked. In other words, in 2003, Sharon, in December, I think, gave a speech on national television where he says, my fellow Israelis, he's now probably among the most popular prime ministers who ever lived in Israel since Ben Gurion. I mean, he is the man who stopped the bombings. Parents were putting their kids on buses again by the end of 2003. And he gets up on national television and he says, my fellow Israelis, I'm paraphrasing, of course, we're getting the hell out of Gaza. And his basic argument was, here's a right-wing Likud leader who smashed the Palestinian Second Intifada with the brute force, with an infantry invasion of cities. And he gets up and he says, also, we're leaving Gaza. His basic argument was, look, we discovered in the Second Intifada that when we withdraw, the vacuum we leave behind in power isn't filled by Jeffersonian Democrats. This is the Middle East. Vacuums are filled by bad guys, right? President Obama's withdrawal from Iraq was filled by ISIS, that vacuum. Now, that's not even an argument that America should stay in Iraq and bleed and spend for all eternity. It's just the argument that if you leave a vacuum in the Middle East, it's filled by bad guys. Not bad guys because they disagree with me, bad guys because they're going to destroy their own society. So we can't leave. We can't leave. They won't reciprocate our withdrawal with peace. They can't. Their politics are too dysfunctional. I don't even need to know why. One point Sharon even says, I don't know why. I don't care why. They can't. We're going to leave because it's good for us. I'm pulling out of Gaza, and if they come at our border after I pulled out to the international border, the UN is going to give me recognition. The Israeli Interior Minister sent a letter to the UN saying we relinquish any claim we may have had to Gaza. Then I get to shoot them because they're just attacking me over an international border. We're done, right? It's not going to be peace. It's going to be withdrawal and unilateral withdrawal and an end to our control over them. That was immensely popular. Sharon gave Israelis this gift of a double whammy. First of all, if they come after us, we're going to crush them. That was the promise, and he fulfilled it in Defensive Shield. And second, we're not going to rule over them forever and ever because it's not good for them and it's not good for us. So it had tremendous support. After he actually carried it out in August of 2005, it had more support the day after than the day before, and Sharon was even more popular. That's important to say. Sharon then has a stroke in, I believe, late November of 2005, and he by then had left Likud and founded another party called Kadima, and his number two in Kadima is now running for prime minister in the 2006 election. And that number two, his name is Ehud Olmert, and he gets up in front of Israelis and he says, by the way, guys, Sharon was going to pull out of the West Bank, or 90% of the West Bank. He called it the convergence plan. Olmert said, he talked about this before election day in 2006. He said, Our good Arik Sharon, who we all love and remember, he was going to pull out of the West Bank. I am going to carry out a major withdrawal from the West Bank. People can Google convergence plan; they'll find his plan. And Olmert, I can't emphasize the drama of what I'm about to say. Olmert won the election after publicly talking about a withdrawal from the West Bank in 2006. Unilateral. We don't wait for their politics because their politics are too screwed up. But getting the heck separated from the Palestinians. Olmert's government is founded in March. He forms a government with the Labor Party. He gives the Labor Party the defense ministry. In other words, the left that wants to pull out of the West Bank is the people he's actually tasking with actually doing the pulling out from the West Bank. He then, I think 10 weeks into his government's existence, in late June of 2006, Hamas in Gaza carries out, 10 months after we've left, carries out their very first tunnel operation. They dig a tunnel under the border, they pop up on the Israeli side, they kidnap Gilad Shalit, they kill 2 other Israeli soldiers, and there's now a shooting war in Gaza. In the middle of the shooting war in Gaza in early July of 2006, Hezbollah up on the northern border, the border with Lebanon, we pulled out of Lebanon in May of 2000. We'd been in Lebanon for 18 years. I'm sorry for the history lesson. It'll end in exactly 1
No, it
minute.
matters. It matters. It's important.
Okay. We pull out of Lebanon in May of 2000 after 18 years there. You ever have that thing, Hugh, where there's a lot of terrorism that comes out of a country and attacks you, so you invade, and it seems like a good idea at the time, but then you get stuck there for 18 years, and then when you pull out, the bad guys take over? So I don't know if that ever happened to you, but
No.
don't do it. That's my advice. That was our Lebanon experience, was essentially the Afghanistan experience of America. In May of 2000, Ehud Barak, the prime minister, pulls us out of Lebanon. 6 years later, July 12, 2006, while the shooting war is happening in Gaza, we had just unilaterally withdrawn from Lebanon. We had just unilaterally withdrawn from Gaza. Hezbollah carries out its first cross-border attack from Lebanon. They kill 4 Israeli soldiers. They kidnap 2 more. And the Second Lebanon War is underway. Over the course of the Second Lebanon War, which lasted roughly a month, 300,000 Israelis had to flee their homes, rocket barrages on Israeli cities of tens of thousands of rockets. We didn't have Iron Dome yet. The small working class towns of the north and the south on the borders of Lebanon and Gaza didn't have enough bomb shelters yet. Israel has spent billions building out those things since, but those didn't exist in 2006. And the Israeli public, which had just elected a government, even though that government talked about a withdrawal from the West Bank, and it was a government with the left, the Israeli public flipped on the question of a withdrawal. And they flipped for a very simple reason. The West Bank is 16 times the size of Gaza. The West Bank shrinks us down to 9 miles wide in the middle. The West Bank is the highlands that overlook all of our major cities. Standing in the West Bank with weapons you can put on your shoulder, you can carry on your shoulder, you can shut down our international airport and all our major population centers. The West Bank is dangerous if it isn't safe. It's not like Gaza or Lebanon, where if there's an enemy there, I can fight that war, I can have 5 years of peace between the wars. In the West Bank, I have to retake the West Bank if the West Bank goes the way Gaza went. So if the West Bank isn't safe, it simply won't work. I'm stopping the history lesson. The Israeli experience, this happened to the left, this happened to the right, is that every vacuum we have left has been filled by forces that say they're in retreat, now you kill them. Every vacuum we have left has led to October 7th of one kind or another. And so how do I, in other words, a left-wing activist will say, how do I pull out of the West Bank? Not why should I? How do I? And we haven't had an answer since 2006. So Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza created the test in the Israeli political world, in the Israeli mind, for whether or not our neighbors, our enemies, the Palestinians, the Hezbollah, are capable of giving us any kind of peace or quiet if we do actually pull back. And the answer has been a resounding no across the Israeli political spectrum.
A deadly no. Now, Haviv, I'm going to take you an extra segment. I just want to warn you because I got to get a question to this. Hugh Hewitt's view, 9/11 changed America fundamentally, post-traumatic stress for the entire country because we had thought ourselves invulnerable to that level of an attack, and that all of the politics since then have been driven by a lot of anger and a lot of fear. What do you think this is going to do to the Israeli public? And I'm going to give you a 30-second warning before we go to break and then let you go on. But I want you, not political. I did that with Yossi. He explained to me where Likud will go in the new party and Naftali Bennett and all this different. I mean, just to the average Israeli psyche, what do you think 10/7 has done and this war?
In a sense, a lot, and in another sense, nothing at all. It woke us up. We'd been asleep for 20 years. We thought everything was manageable, or 15 years. I mean, that was Netanyahu's fundamental strategy: was this is manageable. We can. Time is on our side. In the what is it, 17 years or so since Hamas took over Gaza back in 2007, the Israeli GDP per capita has doubled. In other words, as time goes by, we get more prosperous, we get stronger, we get smarter. And our enemies, because of the nature of our enemies, because they're tyrants, because they're dictators and they're terrible reactionary organizations, are destroying themselves and their polities and their societies. So as time goes by, we don't have to fight bloody, terrible wars with high costs. As time goes by, the power disparity only tilts in our favor. That was the argument. That was the dream. That was Israelis asleep. It wasn't a stupid argument. It just turned out to be wrong. October 7, we woke up, but we woke up to something, just 20 years of quiet being an illusion. We didn't wake, in other words, October 7 is very much in keeping with the Second Intifada. 140 bombings, right? Imagine 140 bombings in America over something that divides America, over race, over, I'm sorry to do it over the thing that hurts the most, but nevertheless, imagine a bombing like the Dolphinarium bombing in 2001 in Tel Aviv. A bomber walks into a non-alcoholic bar, that's a bar for teenagers, and blows himself up and kills 24 kids. Over race. Now, I don't, or an immigrant does that, or, the people who are on the warning side, the anti side will say, see, I told you. That's not the interesting response. The interesting response is, what does a progressive say? How does a progressive politics deal with mass terrorism from a side that, in theory, they agree with the basic cause? That's what happened to the Israeli left, is that the Palestinian political world produced this massive terrorism on October 7, in the Second Intifada, and every generation we've had it. So in a sense, very little happened. We just remembered is what we did. And it's sad, and it's frustrating. We have to live on our sword. We have prospered very greatly. We are the safest, strongest, and happiest Jews who have ever lived in the history of Jews. And we have to live on our sword. And that's okay. It's okay to have both of those be true at once.
Haviv, when Lawrence Wright wrote The Looming Tower, it sort of revealed to me and to everyone that I hadn't been reading Bernard Lewis. I did not know what was going on within the Salafist fringe of Sunni Islam. I understood Iran. But then I'm kind of mad that no one told me. Aren't young Israelis over the next 30 years going to distrust completely older Israelis who didn't see this coming?
I don't think so. And I don't think so because we live much closer to our enemies. We live much closer to our wars. And we all together pay the price. In other words, my father fought in the 73 war. His unit was overwhelmed on the southern Golan by the Syrian advance. He actually spent some significant part of the first 24 hours of that war behind Syrian lines, and most of his fellow soldiers in his battalion were killed in that first day. And I was in the northern West Bank, laying ambushes for the suicide bombers who were trying to sneak over the mountains into Israeli cities to blow up children, and operations in Palestinian cities. And it was a very difficult and painful war. I think I'm fifth generation combat soldier, and I'm from a family of nerds. In any other Western society, none of us would have been soldiers. And so I think that, look, every generation has its war. And this generation has its war. And I think that's how they think of it. In other words, I don't think the current 20-year-olds are going to say, what were you, stupid? The Second Intifada, we thought, well, geez, we were wrong about Palestinian capacity to reciprocate our withdrawals. The 73 war was a mistake. The 67 war was handled phenomenally well, but nevertheless, we were driven into a war. 56 war was this massive Nasserite coalition of Arab armies that had gathered together, and we felt like we were existentially threatened. There's no generation. The enemy always surprises. It's the nature of the enemy. That's what enemies are. They're a thing that surprises you. That's forgivable. How you then react is the task of the generation. And, this generation has shown that it is astonishingly capable and united and brave. And these are kids who grew up on TikTok and walked into fire. when called upon. And so I think they will forgive us for my generation's mistakes, as I have forgiven my father's generation. And I think they have a great task to carry forward, which is to do better than us in the next generation.
Haviv, we'll leave it there. I appreciate this great big slice of your time this morning. Very effective, very, very, very necessary for people to get the history lesson. In fact, I think the combination of ignorance and ideology meeting at the intersection of certainty is why campuses are awash with idiots doing stupid things, and your contribution to curing that is much valued. Thank you, Haviv.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. Thank you.